I'm really delighted to be doing this today, and I want to thank Manuel and also the folks at RK for inviting me. As Manuel said, this is my first foray into conceptual engineering, and I decided to try to do a couple of things, both to do the kind of work in epistemology that I enjoy doing and to reflect on it from the perspective of conceptual engineering. And the framework that I'm going to, or the central framing question that I'm going to be addressing is whether, when one proposes a new category of epistemic assessment, should we think of this as de novo construction or conceptual re-engineering? And I'll talk a little bit about where that distinction comes from in a moment. So here's the overview of what I hope to do today. There are 6 sections of the talk. I'm going to start off with an introduction, and then I'll move quickly into the epistemological background, just defining some key terms. Then what I want to do is I want to explore the case for thinking that epistemology involves invention de novo, as it were, followed by an exploration of epistemology as involving conceptual re-engineering. Why might one think that that's what one is doing when one's doing epistemology? Then I want to spend some time on a case study. I'm going to be introducing what I'm going to acknowledge at the outset is a non-standard category of epistemic assessment. It's a category that you won't find in the contemporary epistemology literature. Nevertheless, I think it's an interesting category, and in fact, I think it's an underappreciated category, and I'm going to try to convince you that in proposing it, I'm actually engaging in conceptual re-engineering. That, I hope, will strike you as a controversial claim. Interesting because controversial. And in the last section of the paper, I'm going to try to defend that claim by exploring a little bit of the methodology behind what I'm doing. Namely, I'm going to try to make explicit my meta-epistemological assumptions and how they connect up with these topics in conceptual engineering. So without further ado, let's just jump right into the talk. As I said, my framing question involves a distinction between de novo conceptual engineering and conceptual re-engineering. I'm taking this distinction from a recent article, a 2020 article from Dave Chalmers, and here's what Dave has to say in this 2020 article. He says, I encourage making a distinction between what I call de novo engineering and re-engineering. De novo engineering is building a new bridge, concept, or whatever. Re-engineering is fixing or replacing an old bridge, program, concept, or whatever. So that is the distinction that I'm using here. And I actually think, and I'm hoping that if I don't convince you of my main thesis, at least I can convince you of this much, that epistemic concepts present an extremely interesting case for this distinction. And the reason they present an interesting case for this distinction is because I think you can make a case both for engaging in epistemology as involving de novo engineering, and a case for thinking that when you engage in epistemology, you are doing conceptual re-engineering. So on the one hand, the case for thinking that you're engaging in engineering de novo is several-fold. First of all, when you think about epistemic assessment, we often engage in epistemic assessment for a variety of distinct, contexts. I'll go over these in a moment. And you might think that if we engage in epistemic assessment in a variety of different contexts and with a variety of different interests in mind, then of course we are free to invent whatever standards we want to satisfy the needs that motivate our engaging in the assessment in the first place. That might suggest to you that when you're doing epistemology, especially when you're proposing non-standard epistemic concepts, you're engaging in engineering de novo. A second reason is that we're often told that the concept of epistemic justification is itself a technical concept or a philosopher's concept, not a concept that's answering to anything that the folk use. And if that's true, you might also think that if that's right, we're free, as it were, to do what we will with this as philosophers, as epistemologists. I should point out to you that on my slides, when you see something in caps and bolded, I mean to be designating the concept rather than the subject matter. So that penultimate bullet point there says the concept of epistemic justification is a technical concept. And what we're going to see is that this idea that we're, as it were, there are a number of ways in which we might think about epistemic justification, is going to give rise to a thesis that was very, very influential in the early to mid 90s. I'm going to call that the thesis, Bill Alston's thesis of epistemic Desiderata. His idea is that there are just a ton of different ways in which beliefs can be good or bad from an epistemic point of view, and we shouldn't think to collapse that variety into a single dimension that we call epistemic justification. And if Alston is right about this, this might also give you a sense that when we're doing epistemology, we're actually doing de novo construction rather than trying to reconstruct a subject matter that we all have in common. And we'll get to there in a moment. So on the one hand, it looks like there are many reasons to think that when we're doing epistemology, we are engaging in engineering de novo. But on the other hand, there are at least two important reasons, and later on I'm going to suggest a third. There are at least two important considerations that might convince you that we're engaging in conceptual re-engineering of already existing concepts. For example, those of you who are epistemologists, or those of you who were following the epistemology literature in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, will recall that when externalist accounts of epistemic justification were first proposed, they were often met with the accusation that they were changing the subject, that they had changed the subject from what it had been to something novel. That was a charge that was leveled by opponents of externalist accounts. And what I see as interesting there is that if that charge is right, it appears as though those who leveled the charge had a sense that there was a distinctive subject matter that we're all supposed to be theorizing about. And if you think that there really is a distinctive subject matter, you might well think that as long as you're sticking within that subject matter, you're actually arguing with people about what is the best account of the concepts for that subject matter. And that looks a lot like a kind of conceptual re-engineering. I'll come back to this in a moment. The second reason you might think that we engage in conceptual re-engineering rather than, if you like, invention or engineering de novo, is that whereas epistemic justification may well be a philosopher's concept, I'm inclined to think that it is, the concept of knowledge would appear not to be a technical concept. And if that's right, then insofar as we're engaging in the theory of knowledge where we're theorizing about knowledge, or we're trying to, as it were, explicate the concept of knowledge, it looks like there is a subject matter and we're all arguing about the best way to understand the nature of that subject matter. And that looks like it's going to involve something like re-engineering. I'll come back to this. For now, the only point I want to make is that it looks like epistemic concepts are an interesting test case for Chalmers' distinction between de novo engineering and conceptual re-engineering. Now, let me just lay out my background language is how I'm going to use it. I'm going to talk about epistemic concepts as those concepts that express the standards employed in epistemic assessment. The concepts will be familiar to you. You all have seen these concepts before, but here are 6 of them. There are, of course, more than this, but those are, if you like, 6 of the main concepts that we often use in epistemology. Secondly, I'm going to be speaking throughout of epistemic assessment. When I speak of epistemic assessment, I'm referring to the act of evaluating a doxastic state, that is either a state of belief or a state of credence, by reference to an epistemic standard. I will be talking primarily about belief, but credence talk will slip in occasionally because I think credence talk is also important for epistemology. Those of us that grew up in the tradition of, if you like, belief-oriented epistemology, we have grown up in a tradition that has tried to make do with 1 or 2 main epistemic concepts. These will be familiar to you. These are the concepts of justification and knowledge. My question today is this: when we engage in theorizing about the concept of knowledge, or the concept of justification, or related concepts, are we engaging in de novo engineering? Are we engaging in conceptual re-engineering? Are we engaging in both? Are we engaging in neither? That's what I want to do. So this is going to involve a little bit of epistemology where I present a new concept and then ask, as it were, reflect on presenting that concept and asking, am what I'm doing in proposing that concept a case of de novo engineering, conceptual re-engineering, both or neither? I should make one last comment. This is to those of you that are allergic to talk of concepts. If you're allergic to talk of concepts, I actually don't think my talk of concepts is crucial today. Because you can equally well ask the kind of question that I want to get at by asking when we're engaging in theorizing about the standards for knowledge or justification, rather than the concepts of knowledge or justification. If you prefer that, whenever I talk about the concept of knowledge or the concept of justification, you can read that as an indirect way of talking about the standards for knowledge or the standards for justification. Okay. With that as my background, let's start off with the idea that epistemology involves invention. And here, to think of the epistemologist and inventor is sort of to think of the epistemologist as free to invent new epistemic concepts to meet the emerging assessment needs of one's friends and family. And here, when you engage in that, you can take inspiration from the concepts that are already in our inventory. So you feel free to go to the epistemologist store and look at all the concepts that are on the shelf. Feel free to be inspired by that. You can take inspiration from that, but you don't have to take inspiration from that. So the hypothesis that we're considering here is the epistemology as invention hypothesis. That's the hypothesis that insofar as conceptual engineering is relevant to the tasks of epistemology, it is engineering de novo. That's the hypothesis here. Why might you think this? Well, I want to just draw your attention to something that you all already know, which are the many motives you might have in engaging in epistemic assessment. I'm going to mention about 10 motives. These are not exhaustive, there are more. These are, if you like, the main motives that I could come up with in an afternoon in the armchair, but I'm confident there are many more of them. All I'm trying to do now is illustrate the variety. You might engage in epistemic assessment when you're evaluating another person's say-so. You might do so when you're assessing a person's moral responsibility, as in what did she know and when did she know it? You might engage in epistemic assessment when you're assessing another's epistemic character, or when you're trying to predict another's actions. For example, you might think that someone is likely to perform an action only if they know such and such, and so you'll assess whether they know such and such. You might engage in epistemic assessment to assess the choice worthiness of an act. You might think, for example, so someone shouldn't perform such and such an act unless she has adequate evidence that P, and that might get you to assess whether she has adequate evidence that P. Or another context, which may or may not be the same as the one that I just mentioned, you might desire to determine the expected utility of an act in advance of performing it yourself. Of course, we all know that expected utility is a function not just of what you desire, not, if you like, not just what your values are, but also what credences you have in likely outcomes. And you might ask whether the credences that you actually have are the credences that are warranted by your evidence. And that's a case of epistemic assessment as well. You might engage in epistemic assessment to settle disagreements when you and I disagree who's got the more reasonable view. You might engage in this when you try to fend off skeptical worries, whether those skeptical worries are practically skeptical. For example, when somebody raises a realistic skeptical alternative, or when you're, as Descartes did, when you're engaging with the skeptic, you might engage in epistemic assessment. And finally, you might engage in epistemic assessment to determine the degree of confidence you yourself ought to have in a proposition's truth. Now, as I say, this is just maybe 10 of the different contexts in which you might engage in epistemic assessment. Once you have a sense of the variety of contexts in which we engage in epistemic assessment, you might then wonder whether for each one of these, there is a single standard to be used. And you might begin to doubt that. And you might begin to think that for each one of these contexts, there might be a different standard. In fact, your doubts may even go further. You may think that even within a single type of context, for example, the type of context where we're fending off skeptical worries, you may wonder whether in different circumstances, different standards apply. And if this is the thought that you have, this might lead you to think, look, as epistemologists, we are free to invent new standards as we will. The only constraint on us is practical. Do they answer our practical needs? And we can invent them from scratch. We can invent them de novo to meet as many of the distinct needs that we have. And you might even go further. You might even go further. You might say to yourself, not only are we free to invent all of these standards, but it looks like we might even doubt whether there is any single standard to which epistemic justification might apply. And here we are at the verge of William Alston's famous thesis that we'll call the thesis of epistemic desiderata. This is taken from his 1993 paper by that title, Many of you will know that he developed this idea in a book a few years afterwards, but what he argued was as follows. He said, quote, "We should abandon the idea that there's a unique something or other properly called epistemic justification. Instead, we should recognize and investigate a number of different ways in which beliefs can be better or worse from an epistemic point of view." If that's your thought, if you're convinced by Alston, you're likely to say, look, philosophers who are debating about, epistemologists who are debating about the nature of epistemic justification are engaging in a bad activity. Really, all they're doing is each one of them is inventing a new standard, and they're perfectly okay to do that, but they should just recognize that there's no disagreement. There's just invention left and right. And again, this is part of a picture that might lead you to think that epistemology is invention rather than re-engineering. Okay. What case is there for thinking about epistemology as re-engineering? Well, what are you even thinking if you think epistemology involves conceptual re-engineering? The thought is that the epistemologist is actually trying to do something with already existing concepts. The idea, the project would be to take some core epistemic concept and explicate how it's to be understood, where this project involves a partly critical task and a partly constructive task. The subject matter is already fixed. That is the already existing concepts. The task is critical, namely to point out why extant proposals are not good, and it's partly constructive, namely to construct a proposal that is good. You can think of this as re-engineering in the same way that an engineer might look at a collection of bridges and ask how well do they do what they're supposed to be doing. If that engineer were to judge that some bridge isn't doing as well as it should be doing, she might well then decide to re-engineer the bridge. And you might think that's exactly what's going on in epistemology. We're looking around, not at bridges, but at, if you like, construals of concepts. And we're thinking, no, that doesn't exactly do what we want it to do. We need to re-engineer it. This is the idea of epistemology as re-engineering. The hypothesis here then is that insofar as conceptual engineering is relevant to the tasks of epistemology, it involves re-engineering previously existing concepts. Why might you think this? Well, as I said to you before, previously I gave you 2 reasons. Now I want to expand that list to 3 reasons. First, the change of subject allegation might actually support epistemology as re-engineering, and I'll talk about how that might work in a moment. Second, Alston's thesis, which I think has some plausibility when it comes to justification, is much less plausible when it comes to knowledge. I'll try to argue for that as well. And then third, there is even a plausible way to defend a re-engineering hypothesis regarding justification, and so the concept of justification as well. And in fact, that's where I confess to all of you, I tend to get particularly excited. That's going to be the project that I want to engage in. I'm going to propose what I'm going to argue is a non-standard account of the concept of justification, or if you prefer, a non-standard account of the standards by which we evaluate whether a belief is epistemically justified. That's what I'm going to try to do in the last part of the talk. But let's actually take these reasons up one at a time. So let's go to the change of subject allegation. The change of subject allegation is usually leveled against those who propose a strikingly new analysis of what they claim to be a familiar concept. And then the proposal that's defending that re-engineered version of the old concept is alleged to have changed the subject. So the response to the proposal is, you haven't given us a proposal about what we wanted. What we wanted was a proposal regarding this subject matter, but in fact, your construal is a construal of a concept that is of a different subject matter altogether. What I want to suggest is that when you level the accusation of a change of subject, you're presupposing a distinctive subject matter. That is the subject matter that we all should be trying to theorize about. And that presupposition of a distinctive subject matter can actually be used to defend a re-engineering hypothesis. Let me try to argue for this in the history of epistemology, or the very recent history of epistemology. Through the early 2000s, externalist accounts of justification were accused of having changed the subject. Those of you who follow this, you'll know that that's a very, very familiar allegation. It was very forcefully presented in the late 90s, early 2000s by Richard Fumerton, among many others, but it was a very familiar accusation. Now I want you to imagine a debate at this very time where externalists are accused of changing the subject. I want you to imagine a debate among competing internalist accounts or proponents of those accounts. And in fact, there were such debates. Presumably, the people who proposed those weren't accusing each other of changing the subject. Rather, they would have said that what they are trying to do is they're trying to capture what by their lights was one and the same concept. If this is the right way to understand what's going on in this case, then you might say that what they were doing, even if their change of subject allegation was correct, they were trying to conceptually re-engineer the concept that would be appropriate to the subject matter that they took themselves to be theorizing about. That's a way of thinking how the change of subject allegation, or at least the presupposition of a coherent subject matter, might be used to defend a re-engineering hypothesis. Now, I want to take this and I want to develop this idea a little bit further. I want to point out, and I think this is true to the history and sociology of epistemology. If you disagree with me, I'm sure it'll come up in Q&A. I want to propose that since the early 2000s, most internalists themselves have acknowledged the epistemic relevance of external factors. To be sure, they don't think that those factors are relevant to what they call justification. They think they're relevant to knowledge, or they think they're relevant, but just not to justification. Now, it's possible to imagine, whether or not it actually happened, it's possible to imagine some of those internalists might come to think that these external factors are in fact relevant to what they were trying to theorize about all along. And if that's the case, then such internalists will have come to see how externalist analyses can be rightly understood as construals of justification. They might still continue to think that they're false construals of the concept of justification, but they might think of them as construals of justification because they think they are, after all, aiming at the same subject matter. What that means is that it's going to be crucial for us to be clear about what the subject matter is in, for example, the theory of justification. Once we have a sense that there is a subject matter, it becomes clear how we can adjudicate whether or not we have a case of people arguing about how to understand that subject matter or the concepts specific to it, or a case of changing the subject matter. Let's go to the second reason why you might think epistemology is re-engineering. Here, I want to say that while it might be tempting to think that there's no single standard corresponding to justification, it's not plausible to think the same for knowledge. So I want you to return to Alston's Epistemic Desiderata quote thesis. We should abandon the idea that there's a unique something or other properly called epistemic justification. Instead, we should recognize and investigate a number of different ways in which beliefs can be better or worse from an epistemic point of view. Now, as I said to you, there's some plausibility to this thesis when you're talking about epistemic justification. In fact, I'm sympathetic with part of what he's saying here, not the whole thing, but part of it. I'm very sympathetic with his idea that there are a number of different ways in which beliefs can be better or worse from an epistemic point of view, and that may well have a bearing on epistemic justification. But watch what happens if we change his talk of, if we change this thesis from a thesis about epistemic justification to a thesis about knowledge. I propose that that does not look as plausible. We should abandon the idea that there's a unique something or other properly called knowledge. Instead, we should recognize and investigate a number of different ways in which beliefs can be better or worse from an epistemic point of view. My thought, and I hope you agree with me because I'm not really going to argue for this, my thought is that this is revisionary not just with respect to theorizing in epistemology, but with respect to ordinary everyday talk about epistemic statuses. It's a highly revisionary thesis that should be regarded with skepticism for this reason. So even if Alston is right about justification, much harder to argue for a epistemic desiderata thesis with respect to knowledge, which means that if we're arguing about the nature of knowledge, it looks like there is a subject matter that we're all trying to capture. And you can think of that as a case of re-engineering the concepts that are appropriate to that subject matter. And then the last point that I want to make, and this point is what I want to spend the rest of my talk developing. So here I'm just going to develop it very, very briefly. I want to suggest to all of you, and this is, I guess, the strongest claim I can defend, that there's a plausible way to defend a re-engineering hypothesis, even with respect to the concept of justification as well. I'm going to spend the rest of my time developing a proposal that I'm about to announce very quickly right now. So let me just give you a sense of why I think that this is at least a plausible thing to argue. And I'm going to do it by arguing against Alston's Desiderata proposal. So against Alston, what I want to say is the following. I want to say, in everyday real life contexts, and what that means, as my wife and my mother often remind me, real life means when you're not doing it philosophy. In everyday real life contexts, we often ask whether a belief was epistemically proper. To be sure, we don't use the language of epistemically proper. We use reasonable. We use was it responsibly formed, so on and so forth. Is it based on good evidence? But that's something that we do all the time in everyday life. I want to suggest that given the role of belief in our efforts at coordination and cooperation with one another, we might well want to settle in advance, that is, in advance of any particular attempt at coordination and cooperation with one another, we might well want to settle on a standard of epistemic assessment, which is such that every one of us is socially entitled to hold any subject to that standard at any time and in any of our practical endeavors. I'm going to be developing this idea in the remainder of my talk today, but the thought is that if I'm right about this, then I think we've got a nice candidate for justification, because we might then take the standard that we're trying to articulate for this purpose to be the standard that the concept of justification itself aims to capture. And I'm going to try to convince you both that this is a good idea and that proposals can be very non-standard and meet this specification. All of that remains to be seen, but that's the kind of thing that I want to argue in the rest of the talk. To do so, I want to start with a case study. And in particular, I want to start off by asking what I'm going to call a non-standard epistemological question. The question is epistemological, and that it's a question about knowledge, but it's non-standard in the sense that if you follow the epistemology literature, the form of the question I'm about to ask is not a form that you will often see in the epistemology literature. It is a form you will see in the philosophy of science literature, but it's not a form that you will see in the epistemology literature. And here's a question. What is known about COVID-19? Notice that if you ask our question Q, if you ask that, this is not asking something about what any particular person knows about COVID-19, nor is it at least explicitly about any particular group of people. You might think it's about the collection of all people whatsoever. That's a possibility. But what makes it a non-standard epistemological question, epistemological in that it's asking about what is known, non-standard in the sense that it doesn't mention any particular subject who would be the subject of the knowledge. And I'll point out that a candidate answer to this question isn't adequate at a time unless the total scientific evidence at that time warrants your answer. That would be a warranted answer to the question. If your answer isn't, as it were, it doesn't make connection to the total scientific evidence at the time, if the total scientific evidence doesn't warrant your answer is a bad answer to that question. Arguably, I'm not going to argue this, and in fact, I don't know whether this is true or not, but I think it's arguable. What's known about COVID-19 is the result of combining all particular individuals' particular pieces of knowledge regarding COVID-19. That might not be quite right. I'm less interested in that because I'm more interested not in what is known, but what are we in a position to know about COVID-19? And that, you might say, what is knowable on the basis of all the scientific evidence we have regarding COVID-19? So this, I think, is a perfectly good question to ask. What is known about COVID-19? You can all imagine circumstances in which we would ask this question. It's non-standard because it does not mention an epistemic subject, but that doesn't make it a bad question. It's still an epistemic question, even if it's non-standard. Now I want to connect up with the standard epistemology literature. Now I want to connect up with traditional epistemology. And now I want to say we can do that by supposing we want to assess a subject's belief about COVID-19. And we want to assess a subject's belief about COVID-19 with respect to what is known about COVID-19. So we're going to say that a subject's belief is in epistemically good shape if it coheres with what's known about COVID-19, and it is not in epistemically good shape otherwise. So I've just introduced this notion, being in epistemically good shape. I've given you a characterization. It's not quite tight enough to be a definition, but you're getting the spirit of this. And what I want to ask is, what are the properties of the property of being in epistemically good shape? Or to ask it slightly less abstractly, what is the property of being in epistemically good shape? And what I want to draw your attention to are three features that this property has that I find very, very interesting. First, it does involve a notion of coherence, but the notion of coherence is very different from what you would find, at least in the epistemology literature. And that's because the notion of coherence is not coherence within any single subject's corpus of belief, but it's rather coherence with what is known about COVID-19. This is a rather demanding notion of coherence. It's more demanding, I think, than what's usually used in epistemology. And that's precisely because in epistemology, you typically don't ask about coherence with information beyond a single subject's, if you like, belief corpus of beliefs. Whereas what I'm suggesting, at least with respect to this property of being in epistemically good shape, this is holding a belief answerable to the total knowledge and the total evidence about COVID-19, whether or not the believer herself possesses that knowledge or that evidence. It's in this sense that this is not a standard epistemic category, standard epistemic standard. It's precisely because it's holding people to evidence and knowledge that they themselves might lack. That evidence and that knowledge provides the standards against which we're evaluating them, and they might well lack that evidence or that knowledge. And that's why I think that at least for most epistemologists, this will strike you as a rather strange notion of coherence and a rather strange epistemic category of being in epistemically good shape. Secondly, second feature, the property of being in epistemically good shape might apply to a subject's beliefs even if they're false, namely, so long as the false beliefs cohere with what is known about COVID-19. I suppose I don't have to convince you that coherence with information is not something that, even if that information is known, even if all that information is true, that is not something that guarantees truth. That means that if you can have a belief that coheres with that information, but it's false, this is actually not a factive notion at all. It's not a factive notion. And then third, if you are proposing being in epistemically good shape as an interesting category, you are presupposing that you have an independent way to spell out the conditions on knowledge. And that's precisely because, as I've introduced the notion of being in epistemically good shape, in the analysans themselves, you have the expression, what is known about COVID-19. So you better well have an independent way to figure out what is known about COVID-19 so that you can then define being in epistemically good shape in terms of that. That means that the notion of being in epistemically good shape can't be the basic epistemic concept. That's quite right. However, it might be part of a non-standard knowledge-first approach to epistemology, or failing that, you might replace the expression what is known about COVID-19 in the analysans with some other expression such as the total scientific evidence regarding COVID-19. Then, so long as you have an independent way to understand what it is for there to be the total scientific evidence is, you can then understand being in epistemically good shape in those terms. Now, what I want to do is I want to introduce three hypotheses about this admittedly non-standard epistemic concept. The first two hypotheses I'm hoping are very uncontroversial. I'm hoping nobody will argue with me about this. The third hypothesis will be where the action is. So the first hypothesis is this. A generalized version of being in epistemically good shape captures an interesting and worthwhile standard of epistemic assessment in science. So consider the following. Here's how we're going to apply this. Where S is a scientist studying COVID-19, and P is some proposition regarding the properties of COVID-19 or its dissemination in a population, the standard says S's belief that P is in epistemically good shape if and only if S's belief that P coheres with what is known about COVID-19. Hypothesis number one. That right there looks like a good standard and a good epistemic standard that you might use in science. Now, to be sure, I have tailored it to this to COVID-19. But the thought is we might generalize on this to come up with a more interesting and more general concept of interest to science. And it would go something like this. For every domain of expertise within science, you might take those scientists who investigate that domain and hold them answerable to what is known in that domain by saying that their belief is in epistemically good shape just in case it coheres with what is known in that domain. So you might take the domain of, I don't know, you might take the domain of biochemistry. That's a large domain, but imagine that we have a biochemist, and you might say, if S is a biochemist, then then her belief is in epistemically good shape so long as her belief coheres with what's known in biochemistry. Or you might think biochemistry is too large a subfield of science. You might want to make it a little smaller than that. That's fine with me. My point is that you can take this notion of being in epistemically good shape and you can generalize it. And my hypothesis number one is the result will at least sometimes be a worthwhile standard of epistemic assessment in science. Here, quick shout out. My friend and collaborator Kaleem Khalifa and I have actually tried to develop this in a recent paper. We are trying to argue that this epistemic standard, which actually is a generalized version of being in epistemically good shape, is in fact a worthwhile standard of epistemic assessment in science. I'm hoping that that actually is not all that controversial. I think it strikes us as pretty uncontroversial, but that's my first hypothesis. Hypothesis number two, I think this is also going to be uncontroversial. No contemporary account in mainstream epistemology construes either knowledge or justification in precisely these terms. That is, in terms, that is as a generalized version of being in epistemically good shape. This is because if I'm right, being in epistemically good shape is itself not factive. That means you're not going to define knowledge in terms of it. You're not going to construe knowledge in these terms since it's not factive. And I think it's fair to say that no contemporary account in mainstream epistemology in the theory of justification construes justification in these terms either. I will leave it to people to disagree with me if you think that I'm wrong about that. I think this is sufficiently non-standard so as to be something that you will not find in the contemporary mainstream epistemology literature in the theory of justification. Third hypothesis, this one is controversial. Even so, the generalized version of the property of being in epistemically good shape is a candidate proposal regarding the concept of epistemic justification. It is a proposal regarding epistemic justification. In particular, according to this proposal, epistemic justification, the concept can be understood in terms of a generalized version of being in epistemically good shape, where the relevant domain of coherence is determined in some yet to be specified way by one's social roles, intellectual responsibilities, and so forth. Now, this hypothesis, I'm hoping, at least for the epistemologists in the audience, I'm hoping that this one gets your hackles up. And I'm hoping this one strikes you as controversial. Because what I want to spend the rest of my time, the rest of my 15 minutes if I can, doing is defending this proposal, hypothesis number three. That is, I wanted to defend the proposal that this is a non-standard account of epistemic justification. And I'm going to do so by returning to the questions with which I started. If I propose a concept like the concept of the generalized version of being in epistemically good shape, is that proposal a case of innovation and invention, as it were, engineering de novo? Is it a case of re-engineering an old concept like the concept of justification, which is what I'm claiming? Is it both? Is it neither? And as I say to you, I want to defend the hypothesis that it is a case of re-engineering an extant concept, namely the concept of epistemic justification. Okay, now I've reached the methodological portion of my talk today. What I want to do in the last 15 minutes of my talk is I want to lay out as explicitly as I can the methodology that I'm assuming when I advance hypothesis number three. That is, when I advance this notion of being in epistemically good shape as a candidate construal of epistemic justification. That is to say, as something that I'm trying to re-engineer in the way that I am suggesting. That's a controversial claim, and I'm going to defend it now by going a little bit into methodology. I imagine that the main charge that I would face if I tried to convince all of you that the concept of being in epistemically good shape or some suitably generalized version of it is a construal of epistemic justification, I'm guessing that I will be accused, as many people are in epistemology, of changing the subject. So what I want to do is I want to say why I think I'm not changing the subject. And in order to do so, I want to remind everyone of what kinds of responses you find in the literature to the change of subject charge. I counted at least 4 responses to the change of subject charge. I won't go into great detail about these. 2 of the responses are owed to Sally Haslanger. She has defended herself against the change of subject charge, both by appeal to the metasemantic thesis of semantic externalism. That's a thesis about how concepts get their content. She's responded to the change of charge by proposing a functional role conception of concepts. In addition to Haslanger's two ways of trying to respond to this charge, Sarah Sawyer, in a series of very interesting papers in the last few years, has suggested that we need to make the distinction between conceptions and concepts. And what she has suggested is that conceptual engineers really are arguing for social conceptions associated with concepts rather than the concepts themselves. That's the way that she suggests that we respond to a change of subject charge. And then more recently, in a paper in Mind, Mark Pinder has a very interesting argument where he suggests that what you're doing when you're engaging in conceptual analysis, in conceptual engineering, is you're really trying to convince people that they ought to have certain speaker meanings in mind when they use certain terms. Speaker meanings rather than semantic meanings. Semantic meanings fix the subject matter. What you're doing when you're engaging in conceptual engineering is trying to convince people that they ought to have certain speaker meanings in mind. I should point out, Pinder himself wasn't quite as worried about the change in subject charge as he was about the efficacy with which we can actually engage in conceptual engineering and especially conceptual re-engineering. But that, for my purposes, that doesn't matter. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to borrow Haslanger's second answer, her functional role response. And what I'm going to try to do is give you a sense of why, if you think of concepts as answering, at least epistemic concepts, as answering to a certain functional role, then you can see my proposal as a proposal of conceptual re-engineering. So let's start with Haslanger herself. Here's what she had to say. I point out she said this in the very first lecture that started this series earlier this year. What she said in that lecture was the following, and I'm quoting from her handout. In some cases of amelioration, we should look to the function of a concept to determine how to proceed. What function does this concept serve? Concepts or orientations are part of the cultural techne that keep a social system, interdependent practices, institutions, and structures running because they focus our attention on features of the world around which we coordinate and call for approved responses. If the system is flawed, a concept, schema, orientation, or social meaning may be a source of the flaw because broad social possession of it and action in accord with it entrenches injustice. Now, if you're familiar with Haslanger's work, you know that she herself focuses on the injustice part of things and the entrenchment of injustice. I'm not interested today in injustice, although that is an interesting question within epistemology. I'm not interested in the question of injustice, and that's in part because the system that I'm primarily interested in talking about today is the epistemic system, if you like, the set of all of our epistemic concepts and all of our epistemic practices. So I'm not so much interested in injustice, the entrenchment of injustice, as I am in the entrenchment of inferior epistemic assessments. But if I change things so that it reads like this, I'm going to be with Haslanger. This is the kind of view that I want to try to push for. So here is my admittedly highly programmatic meta-epistemology that I'm assuming. And I'm starting off with what I'm borrowing from Haslanger herself. The subject matter of epistemic concepts as a class is fixed by their functional role. And that functional role is to capture the standards used in epistemic assessment. Within that class, there are various possible standards that we might employ. This is going to be a very important point for me, and that is that our practices of epistemic assessment, when they are systematic, can be characterized as constituting a distinct tradition of epistemic assessment. So just to give you a sense of the kind of thing that I have in mind, imagine assessments that take place in contexts involving an engagement with the skeptic, or the evaluation of a scientific theory, or the evaluation of a public policy, or the potential allocation of moral responsibility. These are taken from the possible context that I talked about at the beginning of my talk. Each one of these, if I'm right, constitutes a tradition of epistemic assessment because there's a kind of systematic nature of assessments in that context. I propose that one goal of epistemology is to articulate, and if possible, improve upon the standards involved in the various traditions of epistemic assessment. In aiming to articulate these standards, there's room for disagreement. And in fact, there's room for disagreement along two different dimensions. First, about the facts of the tradition. The facts themselves may be unclear, their relative weight may be in dispute, how they hang together may be contested. But there's also room for disagreement about the standards of the tradition themselves. The standards of a tradition may be underdetermined by the facts of the tradition, or there may be disagreements over proposed idealizing assumptions that people make. Or alternatively, there may be disagreements over how many distinct standards are in play within a given single tradition. All of this is possible. When these disagreements take place within a given tradition of assessment, we can treat them as disagreements regarding how to articulate that tradition's core epistemic standards, and so their core epistemic concepts. Because the tradition fixes the subject matter only to the degree to which the facts constituting the tradition are fixed, we get the idea that the subject matter is fixed or determinate only to the degree determined by the facts constituting that tradition. So traditions may well be, to some degree, indeterminate. And then you can imagine what people are doing is they're introducing a kind of determinacy that wasn't there previously. That might be engineering de novo. To the extent that it is fixed, however, you can imagine people actually disagreeing about the fixed subject matter, where that subject matter is fixed by the facts of the tradition itself. With all this in mind, you might think of epistemic disagreements as disagreements about the best way to systematize and articulate the range of facts constituting a tradition of epistemic assessment. Systematize, that's the key element. What do we mean by systematize? What I'm going to suggest is that systematization involves a balance of empirical accommodation and conceptual amelioration. Empirical accommodation, a matter of accommodating the facts of the tradition. Conceptual amelioration, nudging the tradition towards the standards that better meets its needs from the perspective of that very tradition. That's my meta-epistemology. You might ask yourself, well, what does this have to do with epistemic justification? If there are lots of different traditions, lots of epistemic concepts, what's special about epistemic justification? And my answer is that this is the concept that aims to capture the standards involved in what I regard as arguably the central tradition of epistemic assessment, namely the assessment of one's other beliefs or doxastic states in contexts in which we aim to cooperate and coordinate with one another, where the likelihood of success depends on the truth of our beliefs. If that's right, I now can advance the following meta-epistemological thesis. An epistemic concept is a concept of epistemic justification, and hence it's a candidate construal of the concept of justification, just in case it purports to capture the standards of the tradition of epistemic assessment as those are employed in our attempts to cooperate and coordinate with one another. That's my meta-epistemological thesis. That alone doesn't settle the problem that I'm trying to address, because you will immediately note that there could be many standards that are alleged to fit the bill. And so if that's right, many different concepts of epistemic justification to choose from, how should we decide between them? Here I want to introduce a new something to the epistemological literature, and I'm going to call this the fundamental epistemological coordination problem, or the FECP. And I'm going to introduce the problem by saying that I'm going to assume that our beliefs and our doxastic states more generally do play a central role in our efforts at coordination and cooperation with one another. The fundamental epistemological coordination problem is addressing the question, what normative epistemological expectations of each other should we settle on as we try to cooperate and coordinate with each other in contexts in which the likely success of these efforts depends on the truth of our beliefs. I want to suggest to you that the FECP is a coordination problem, and that's precisely because there are many standards that might fit the bill, and we need to coordinate on the choice of a standard in a context in which we have a motive to cooperate. In fact, there are at least two dimensions of variability that we have to align ourselves on. First, there's Alston's point. There are many desiderata in epistemic assessment. We have to pick which desiderata are the ones that matter. We have to coordinate on that. But second, even once you choose one of those desiderata, even once you choose a desideratum, the job isn't over. Imagine that you choose the desideratum of reliability. You still need to choose what threshold of reliability is the threshold that we will accept. You don't want it to be too high. You don't want to be too low. We need to coordinate as well with respect to the threshold. So it is, I think, a real coordination problem. And it's a coordination problem precisely because I think failure to be aligned on an epistemic standard is a failure of coordination, which itself can lead to what all sides should agree on is an inferior outcome. And I can imagine at least two kinds of inferior outcome: the decision not to cooperate after all, or failure in the outcome of the cooperative effort itself. Both of these are non-ideal outcomes. They should be non-ideal from everyone's perspective. And since they can result from a failure to align, this is it's a coordination problem. It is a problem. Task for the epistemologist. rank order the various candidate construals of the concept of justification according to the relative goodness of their proposed solutions to the FECP. Such a ranking, I think, is going to judge accounts according to how well they systematize the tradition of epistemic assessment in contexts of cooperative coordination. That is, how well they accommodate the facts of the tradition, but also whether their proposed standards offer a conceptual amelioration within the tradition. Let's just quickly review that. What are the facts you have to accommodate? They include things like the range of contexts in which you engage in those assessments, the range of interests you have in doing so. We might have different interests when we're trying to cooperate or coordinate with one another. The normative expectations we bring to bear in such contexts. The particular verdicts we reach across the range of relevant cases. If you like, these are the things we train our intuitions to try. These are our intuitions that we want our theories often to capture. And also the vocabulary that we use in these verdicts. I also say, though, that what you're going to be judged by is whether your proposed standard offers a conceptual amelioration in the tradition. How would that work? Well, my thought here is that an argument to this effect might be made precisely in terms of your solution to the FECP itself. You might try to argue that your proposed solution does better at preserving various epistemic desiderata than other proposed solutions. And I want to imagine as well that it could be possible to add additional constraints that we might motivate and impose on a solution to the FECP, where if you add those additional constraints, it would enable us to settle on a single best epistemic standard for that tradition. I say I want to imagine this as a possibility. I have no argument that that will actualize. For all I know, that won't actualize. I'm just advertising it right now as a possibility. Two claims I want to leave you with, and I'm almost finished right now. First claim, any attempt to frame a candidate for the best solution to the FECP competition is not only a construal of justification, but also a case of conceptual re-engineering. It's a construal of justification by the lights of my meta-epistemological thesis, because my meta-epistemological thesis says that an epistemic concept is a construal of justification just in case it purports to capture the standards of epistemic assessment for contexts of cooperation and coordination. And any proposed best solution to the FECP just is something that purports to capture the standards of epistemic assessment for those contexts. But it's also a case of conceptual re-engineering because we are trying to engineer standards that better fulfill this function. The function here is to solve the fundamental epistemological coordination problem. We are trying to engineer standards that best fulfill that function, that of being a good solution or perhaps the best solution to the FECP. So I think it's a case of conceptual re-engineering. We might well look at other proposals and say they don't do as good a job. Ours does better for this and that reason. Finally, second claim, any attempt to argue that one's candidate is a winner of this competition is an attempt at conceptual amelioration. It is an attempt at conceptual amelioration precisely because you're suggesting that you are doing a better job at what we've all been trying to do all along, namely come up with a standard that serves our interests when we are assessing one another in contexts of potential cooperation and coordination. I advance these claims on the basis of the following two thoughts. I think I'm going to skip this because in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this section. What I'm going to do now is just return to my proposal, and this is my penultimate slide so I can finish by 10. Returning to my ultimate proposal, my meta-epistemological thesis is the thesis that an epistemic concept is a candidate construal of the concept of justification, just in case it purports to capture the standards of the tradition of epistemic assessment that we employ in our attempts to cooperate and coordinate with each other. And my epistemological thesis, this goes back to the case study, my epistemological thesis was that a subject S's belief that P is justified just in case it satisfies the epistemic standards that others would be socially entitled to hold S to account given S's social roles, social responsibilities, and so forth. What I want to suggest is that this gesture in the direction of an epistemological thesis may well strike you, especially if you're an epistemologist, as non-standard and perhaps even a bit bizarre. What makes it bizarre is that the standard I'm proposing appeals to evidence and knowledge that the subject herself might not have. And you might say, how in the world could there be a standard that appeals to evidence and knowledge a subject doesn't have that is the standard of whether her beliefs are justified? That might strike you as bizarre. But I want to suggest that if my meta-epistemological thesis is correct, then my epistemological thesis is not a case of construction de novo. Rather, it's a case of conceptual re-engineering, because we're engineering a standard that's the standard that we're all trying to capture. Namely, it's the standard that we employ in the tradition of epistemic assessment when we're trying to engage in cooperation and coordination with one another. And I want to leave you with a thought that if it strikes you as bizarre, that may well be because it aims at conceptual amelioration. This does a better job, if I'm right, than other proposed standards at the very thing that all of us were trying to do all along. And on that note, I say thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.